But how about starting with, I think I'd call it your specialty from all I've seen, is just a review of habitat in general and the parameters that need to be considered for things to grow, temperature, precipitation, pH, bacteria, type of soil, etc.
Yeah, you
A
know,
lot of people don't seem to be aware of all those variables.
right,
Maybe
absolutely.
maybe nobody is totally aware, but
Right. Well, and we don't hear a lot about habitat. It's not one of those topics that's brought up in the K through 12 indoctrination system. If you look in a dictionary for a simple definition, I
yeah.
believe it's the online Merriam-Webster dictionary that I got this one from. Quote,
Hmm.
the place or environment where a plant or animal normally lives and grows.
Hmm.
And what that doesn't include from an ecological perspective is the myriad factors that contribute to the place or environment where a plant or an animal normally lives and grows. It also fails to acknowledge that we don't simply divide the world into plants and animals anymore, but these are minor points for the most part.
Hmm.
If people can just wrap their minds around the place or environment where a plant or animal normally lives and grows, and then apply that to humans, I think that's a pretty good start. And don't apply it to contemporary humans because, for the most part, contemporary humans live and grow in cities. And
Yes.
that's not our evolutionary roots. That's not where we came from. That's not
Hmm.
the quote habitat where we have evolved through time to live and grow. So, we're a great ape. And as with the other great apes, there is a set of living conditions that supports our own survival and did so for the first approximately 300,000 years of the species Homo sapiens, and for a lot longer than that for the genus
Hmm.
Homo. And
Yes.
what we have done in turning jungle into urban jungle or an urban zoo is destroy the place or environment where we normally live and grow. And so we have converted those jungles, those savannas, those forests, those grasslands where people thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. And in converting them to concrete and cityscape and places to store food and places to store water for future release, we have ultimately created a very convenient set of living arrangements for the humans who are here today, but at great cost to other organisms, non human organisms, and also to the future of humans with respect to where they might live and grow. And that's the wilds. That's where we
Hmm.
came from. If we are to have a long future, and at this point it seems unlikely that we will, but if we are to have a long future, it won't be in New York City. It won't be in London. It won't be in Los Angeles. It will be in the places that we came from. And
Yeah.
so that's
I was
enough. That's enough to start.
yeah. I was thinking about. We talked about you growing up. I don't want to go through all of that, but basically, in a nutshell, I'd say it was in northern Idaho. Your father was very much into the outdoors. You guys went hunting and fishing, and all the meat you ate was actually free range, of course, because you got it yourself.
Right.
And now people, even people who would like to do that, have very few places that I'm aware of where that can be done
Well, right.
safely.
And we have contaminated even that food source. The food
Yeah.
sources that we shot and cut with a hook have been so contaminated that there are very few people anymore who have not heard of chronic wasting disease, which is the white-tailed deer and mule deer equivalent of mad cow disease.
Yeah.
And
right.
you know, we have, through our industrialization at the world scale, we have spread these horrors throughout the world, and now they are coming home to roost. Now we're at the point that you can't take your 14-year-old son out to the wilds with a fishing rod or a rifle and expect to bring home a meal that you can actually eat at the end of the day or the end of the week.
Yeah. And we have, the Great Salt Lake is, I can see it, from my upstairs window, so it's very close. But running to it is, what do they call it? The Jordan River, actually, and it's highly polluted. I see people fishing there all the time. I like to think they're doing catch and release, but I think some of them they can take it home and eat it, and that we produce some of the most noxious chemicals here in Salt Lake. It's
right,
probably not too different from other cities, but
right,
but it ends up
and I think,
there.
yeah, I think we talked about this once before, that I would go out with my family and we'd take a Sunday drive and stop at one of a handful of places my parents knew about, and we would just grab the tin can that was resting there and fill it with the spring water and drink it right there, and then leave the tin can for the next person. And I can't imagine there's a handful of places that you can do that in the continental United States anymore.
Yeah, I had some experience with that. Let's see, would have been about 75 when I first came to Utah. I got a gig with the Wasatch Mountain Club to do a trail guide to the higher peaks and ridges. They had already had one out for the lower, easier trails. Anyway, I was up near Lone Peak, which is probably about 11,000 feet. And absolutely beautiful place. I mean, it is wilderness. You can be literally in the wilderness and look down on Salt Lake Valley. Quite astounding.
Right.
But anyway, the water just looked super clear. I thought, well, there's nothing. There's no sheep up here. There's no cattle grazing. So it's got to be okay. No giardia.
Right.
Well, I did drink it from there, and I did get giardia, which took me out for 2 weeks. I was up and down to the bathroom like every 10 minutes. It was unbelievable.
Right.
I had two dreams I was delivering a baby. So much pressure I had in my stomach. But yeah. So yeah, it's just tragic. But getting back to the actual parameters, you talked last time about the precipitation and how the climate change is shifting the water patterns, the rainfall patterns, to either drought or flooding, often in places where the exact opposite has been the case. Like in Australia recently, one of the large desert areas that hardly ever saw rain was suddenly getting deluged, untold feet of water ripping through it, and it's like a hard pan surface.
Right. And one of the things that has been predicted for a long time by climate scientists is that we will see increased variability in precipitation. And sure enough, you look to Southern California, to the Los Angeles Basin, for example, and they've already received more rain this year than they did all of last year. And it's mid-February. Yeah. And so we're going to see, and we are seeing, the expected outcome that in general, dry places get drier and wet places get wetter, but there's variation laid over the top of that, so that even those places that we thought were going to be generally drier have these years or months or sometimes only hours in which the precipitation is much, much higher than it has been sometimes for all of history, and sometimes just within the last 50 or 100 years.
Just okay. Then we talked also, I think, about people talking about, well, we could just move the crops further north or whatever direction they think they need to go. And you were talking about
Right.
People are,
I hear a lot that and I'm not sure who the we is. I don't
yeah,
think it's you and me. That some group of humans will take a bunch of seeds of the necessary crops, wheat, corn, whatever, and plant them further north because in general, the precipitation and temperature patterns are moving further north. It must have been more than 5 years ago that the USDA changed their seed chart, their vegetable growing chart, to reflect this general pattern. But the problem is that all of those things that we have been growing for so long and that are necessary to support this version of civilization, all of them require a certain set of soil conditions, precipitation conditions, length of day conditions,
right,
and
yeah,
and a whole bunch of biological factors of the soil that most people don't even know about, much less have they thought deeply about. So soil is not dirt. Dirt,
right,
dirt, to quote a professor of mine from many years ago, dirt is soil that's out of place. Soil is alive. Soil has a bunch of microbes and fungi in there that actually facilitate the transfer of water into the plants as well as the nutrients into plants. So it's not a matter of just shifting the seeds from one place to another, not even remotely.
yeah. It's a whole, any square foot of soil is an ecosystem unto itself. I recall reading some time back that actually a couple of times that a teaspoon of soil has, I forget now, maybe these numbers become so large as to be beyond our serious comprehension, but hundreds of millions of bacteria.
Right. A
And
cubic
one piece,
in any given place, a cubic meter of soil will have more organisms than all of the land you can see where you're standing, from which you extract that cubic meter.
yeah,
And
yeah,
there in any given place, if we're talking about a typical savanna or a typical North American forest, there might be hundreds of species above ground within view, and that pales in comparison to the number of species that occur in the soil. It's a very
yeah.
complex, intricate web down there that we so frequently take for granted.
I've read that there's actually more life underground than above ground.
There's there's no question about it,
Yeah, yeah,
and
okay,
and it's one of those things that we have only barely begun to study.
yeah,
We've barely looked at the oceans from whence we came, and we've barely looked below ground because it's obvious why we have our prejudices because we live right here on land.
mm-hmm.
People don't generally live very long below the deep ocean or
Yeah,
underneath the ground, and so it's easy to understand why we have this bias towards the things that surround us, of course. But that doesn't make it any less obvious that with a little bit of study, there's a huge number of species below ground and below water that we don't even know about.
yeah, yeah. I remember reading also that if you look at a tree and you see the mass of the tree, just contemplate that whole mass of the tree, that there's more or an equal amount of that underground in the form of roots, often going much deeper than we thought. There was a video on, so I get Curiosity Stream. There's some pretty good videos on there. But they were digging deep into the soil and then they'd put, with tubes they could go down with ladders and whatnot. And they had probably acrylic windows where they could see what the soil was like. And in this particular case, they were looking at the roots, and they were astounded to see how much deeper those roots went. I forget which particular tree that was, but it implied it was probably true for most trees.
Right, absolutely.
These roots went 60 feet down, much to their astonishment.
Yeah,
And some of the more lively activities were way down there.
right. Yeah, there's a lot going on below ground, and it's so difficult to study that we,
Yeah.
we've barely scratched the surface, as it were, of
Yes.
soils and marine systems.
Yeah. Yeah, like the phytoplankton, which produces, what, 60% of the oxygen, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, that's really convenient stuff, and we know very little about it.
Yeah, except that it's disappearing.
Right.
Rapidly.
we we know how
Eutrophication and
we know how to kill things. You have to hand us
Yep.
that. We got that down.
yeah, that was we're experts in that department, and becoming more expert, I'm afraid, every day.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, one of the things I asked last time that I found your answer very interesting was what you would do if you were, we'll just say, in charge of the Department of Energy or whatever, significant. Say you were dictator of the world, just hypothetically. What would be your order of priorities? I think is how I phrased it, something like that.
Yeah, and I'm completely in line with the folks at Extinction Rebellion on this topic.
Right.
I think that governments must tell the full truth about what's happening in the world. And so, if I were emperor for a day, clothes and all, I would insist upon full disclosure. I don't see any governments doing that, and I understand why, because full disclosure would almost certainly stop a lot of people from jumping onto the treadmill, which means that a bunch of billionaires would lose billions of dollars. So I understand not wanting to reveal the full truth. I really do. But is that just? Is that moral? If your medical doctor does that to you, we call that malpractice. But if governments do that to us, we consider that normal business as usual.
Well, it would be. I mean, it shouldn't be, but it is.
Right. Absolutely. And so that's the first thing I would do is I would tell people what I know, what is supported by evidence, instead of dancing around and only going halfway, as so many people do. And it's not just politicians, obviously. It's
right. Yes.
It's most climate scientists as well.
Yeah.
And I understand. I really do understand people's addiction to wishful thinking, to their desire to hang on to hope, because hope is something that has been presented to us, just assumed really, as uniformly good without question. And so we always hope for something better to come along, and that assumption that it will come along contrasts with the evidence regarding abrupt climate change and destruction of habitat. How could it be any different? Of course it does. And I'm not sure how to tell people that, and I've been
working at it for a couple of decades.
Right. I really have. I've been working at this for a long time to try to tell people what is coming without, quote, shattering their dreams, without making people upset so that they just turn off the news stream. It's not just climate change. It's not just abrupt climate change. It's everything that is difficult to present and difficult to take in a world afflicted with the infinite growth paradigm.
Yeah, right. It's just such a major problem. We talked a little bit about, let's stick with this one thing. Simply making people aware is critical if there's to be any change at all. Awareness is the first step to change. I think we know that. But then, from all you've researched, read, studied, talked to people, whatever, you seem to have concluded that we are, beyond the point of no return, as have many others. And I feel the same way myself. The more I learn, the more so that is. However, just putting you back as the emperor there for a day or a year or whatever, if you got people aware, bioengineering.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
I think that it's time to have the conversation that a lot of medical doctors recommend to their patients when the situation is hope free, when the situation points to an enormous likelihood that you're in your final weeks or months or maybe even days. And that's hospice. That's hospice at the planetary level. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
time for us to come to grips with our imminent demise and to complete the relationships that are left hanging, to tell the stories that we want to tell our children, our grandchildren, our loved ones, and stop with the half truths and the lying to each other, the hiding
Yes.
information from each other, and move on to the whole story. And I don't see a lot of people when they're in hospice who decide they need more things, decide they need more shoes or more baubles, more jewelry. Instead, what I see is people living the life that is authentically representing them and having the conversations that they were reluctant to have not so long ago.
Yeah. That's a good idea, regardless. Of in fact, all your suggestions that I've seen are a good idea. Things we should be doing anyway. Kind to one another. Um, Looking at equitability, justice, fundamental things. Laying down our weapons, turning them into plowshares. It's just a good idea. Period.
Right,
Uh,
right. I think so.
yeah.
And that's one of the difficult things about transmitting this message is that it seems so clear. It seems so straightforward to me,
Mm-hmm.
and yet
Mm-hmm.
when I present it to other people, I get this look like I'm out of my mind.
Yeah. Well, many people have seem oblivious to just say, for example, the importance of insects, which to me is like way high on the list. I was showing my wife a picture I'd seen a couple of years ago now. What a grocery store would look like without just honeybees,
Right.
and the shelves were pretty vacant
Right.
in a lot of areas.
Would we even have spam?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I was in Boy Scouts, we figured out what the initials stood for: scrambled penises and mastectomies. I've kind of viewed it that way ever since. I think I'd rather starve than live on spam.
Right.
Yeah. So, going back to Dave Brower, who's been one of my, I put him highest on the pedestal of any human I've, got to know a bit. But when I interviewed him, he quoted at one point, we were talking about, I asked him something like, how do you stay optimistic, in face of all that's going on around us again in about 77? And he said, well, my optimism is a very guarded optimism, and it comes from in the talks that I give and how the youth respond. So they connect immediately to what I'm saying. They get very excited about doing things. Now, this is back when we had more that we could do, of course.
Right.
But he also then quoted, I think it was Goethe that he quoted, I think it's from, I've seen it in different sources, but he said, despair is a sin. But it seems to me that so is dishonesty. And so you're trying to reconcile those two things, being honest, seeing what you see, and it's pretty impossible for me at least to get past the despair about it, except to focus on other things that I can do, But even there, the things I can do that would be meaningful to society take time that I don't think we have.
Right. Well, you know, a couple of things come to mind. Edward Abbey was famous for saying, "Action is the antidote to despair."
Right.
So there is this seeming necessity to do something. And we see this reflected in the funeral industry, where the process of sticking somebody in the ground after they die goes on for a week or so and involves all these rituals. And I like what Stephen Jenkinson says as well. Grief is required to proceed. And how do we grieve? This becomes important because in contemporary society, the grief has been turned over to these actions, to these rote traditions, these ceremonies that we go through. And I think for the most part, they stall grief. They don't allow people to come to grips with the fact that somebody close to them will no longer be near them.
Yeah.
That's the grieving part. And I think that we do need to grieve about what we're doing to planet Earth, to the many, many hundreds of species we drive to extinction every month. I think that grief is necessary to proceed as for our own health, for our own mental health.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, you have. I've seen this a couple of times with different people, particularly my dad, who died in 2015. He never, I don't think, ever fully grieved getting over the death of my mother, who died just before 9/11. He carried on, but he never, I don't know, maybe processed, not the best word, but processed that, internalized the grief, felt it.
Right. It's not something that our culture, that our society is well adapted for. In February of 2014, I participated in a workshop with the Grief Recovery Institute that displayed to me quite quickly that a number of things that I had been taking for granted and that were actually wrong. I didn't even know what grief was, and I didn't know how to get through it. One of the myths we hear is that time heals all wounds. No, that's actually not true.
Yeah, I think Shakespeare got that wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you have to, if you have a sliver in your calf muscle, for example, or a piece of shrapnel, and you just leave it in there, then time does not heal it. The scar tissue grows around it and so on. If you actually want to heal it, you might need to go in there with a scalpel and dig it out and then deal with the subsequent potential for infection, clean it out, but get that offending item out of there. That applies to muscles. The same applies to your heart. When you have a splinter in your heart and it's causing all kinds of pain, you might have to go in there. You might actually go into your heart intellectually and emotionally and deal with the feelings that you're having instead of just waiting for time to heal everything.
Yes. Yeah, quite true. Quite true. We talked also about the IPCC report that gives us, if you want to call it, gives us 12 years to change our ways, which in itself seems impossible to me, from as rational as I can look at it. But you've consistently pointed out that they're one of the most conservative bodies in the world, and yet a lot of people, such as, I don't know about Extinction Rebellion, their take on it, I imagine it's similar to the so-called Green New Deal, or the Sunrise Movement. That we have some time to work things out, but even if we had 12 years, the transitions that would need to be made just physically in terms of our use of energy seem impossible. People are utterly resistant to the idea of non-breeding, which seems to be, for sure, at the core, one of the core elements that got us to where we are today.
Right. And that's one of the sacred cows that is never addressed. And my goal here is not to offend people who have had children,
Right.
because after all, most people within the society have capitulated to their DNA, which screams at all of us to make copies
Yeah.
of ourselves. And
Right.
it's the society as well, it's nature and it's nurture. But we've known since the 1960s, when Garrett Hardin and Paul Ehrlich and Ann Ehrlich were sounding the alarm, that there were too many people on the planet then. And
Yeah.
and there's been no significant discussion on the topic, much less action being taken in this society.
People are still criticizing Thomas Malthus.
Right.
Now, it was fundamentally correct, but of course,
And
couldn't.
and he didn't put a date on it.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not that
exactly.
he's been proven wrong, because he
Right.
didn't make any prediction involving a date. So I don't know why people are so quick to take offense with what he wrote.
Yeah. Yeah, it has astounded me. I saw that interview or discussion between you and Paul Ehrlich, and I thought that was very informative. That every adult should see. I'm a little harder core about the reproduction at this point. I think that to start, okay, if you've already had kids, history, love them, do the best you can. But for anyone contemplating breeding now, I say they've got to be pathological sickos to bring another human into the world, or totally ignorant, either willfully or otherwise. It just makes zero sense. And if people are interested in, one of the early comments in I think the New Testament, go forth and breed or something to that effect. It's like if we truly wanted to have more humans, we should be spreading it out over,
Right.
hundreds of years or whatever, but
Right.
doing it all at once
Well,
pretty much kill everything.
but this is the thing, right? What we know rationally, and we know rationally now, that the combination of consumption, specifically personal consumption, and the number of people is what is driving the complete destruction of the living planet. We know that.
Yeah.
There is no question. This is not a scientific question that is open for debate any longer. We know this. But then try to balance that with our DNA, which screams at us through the process of natural selection to make babies, because of course it does. That's how every previous species has, quote, succeeded. That's how we get to have more individuals and persist as a species a little longer. So it's, we are poorly designed by evolution through natural selection for a finite world. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, but had we used our intellect some time back, people could have had vasectomies, could have had just not had kids, in different ways.
Of course.
Birth control pills came out. I'm thinking like the 20s or 30s. And
Of
they
course.
improved over time.
Absolutely. So much we could have done. Seriously.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult when you're pushing up against evolution. From the first course I taught on a college campus that was mine to teach in the autumn of 1988. From that course through every course I ever taught on any college campus, I pleaded with my students to not have children. And I don't know any of them, not one, who took my advice and decided not to have children. And so I understand the difficulty. I understand that we're fighting billions of years of evolution in our genetic material that is screaming at us, and I understand, and Nietzsche understood this, and he gave up on the Superman, the Übermensch, who was going to overcome his evolution, his natural selection, to make decisions based strictly on intellect instead of on evolution through natural selection. And we're, on the one hand, I detest what we've done, but I don't detest my parents for having me.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and so this is sort of mixed bag. There's this culture, nature and nurture are telling us are giving us two different messages. And it's difficult to adopt one and abandon the other when the one is so deeply buried within our DNA.
It has often seemed to me that we have, in fact, different subspecies of Homo sapiens. If you look at the intellectual side of it, the cognitive side, and the decisions that we make, some people seem to be dedicated or at least strongly leaning towards truth, and others seem to push it away out of fear or who knows what. And it's as if, our intellectual development has put evolution on steroids. But it could could have gone the other way if people really applied their brains to, if you want to say, to a religious person, your God-given brains to look at things carefully here.
Right, absolutely. And I suspect most people throughout history have had the intellect to make the decision. And I also understand that it is difficult in light of the evolutionary urge to do other than what has been done. I mean, it's flight or fight first and foremost. That's what's screaming at us and every other species throughout history. And then the survivors are pushed to procreate. And then after that, it's the acquisition of material possessions. And so these things, we are fighting really challenging evolutionary forces to try to clean up our act. And so maybe it was set in stone from the first time the first human being lit a fire, or maybe it was from the first time that the first human being came into existence and procreated for the first time. I don't know when it became unstoppable intellectually. If we were able to harness our intellects and use our intellects to overpower our emotions, then I suspect it was relatively recently that we made the fundamental errors, like within the last few generations. But if we were never capable of harnessing our intellects and let that override our evolutionary tendencies, then maybe we never had a chance. And maybe the 315,000 years of Homo sapiens and the couple million years in something resembling humanity was doomed from the beginning. It's hard to make a case either way.
The fact that so many people, I would estimate millions at least, do realize these things, the consciousness does seem to be there as to what we have to do. Well, in terms of reproduction, I'm just talking strictly here. That awareness seems to be, pretty alive and well in many ways. For example, I was raised strict Catholic, and I can say pretty factually from the untold numbers of Catholics I've known, not to mention going to 12 years of Catholic school, that they have just chosen their own path and not procreated. Maybe more than one or two, maybe none at all, has been the case with myself.
There are absolutely some individuals who are able to avoid what seems like evolutionary fate. That includes you, that includes me, that includes, we know thousands of people who have not had children. This includes Paul and Anne Ehrlich, and the people who have been pointing out these things have been pointing them out for more than 50 years. Obviously, there is the intellectual ability to overcome our evolutionary tendencies, but clearly that has not happened at the sufficient scale to get us to a point today that we're living humbly on the earth. So now we're here. Now we're here with 7.7 billion other people and trying to figure out how to deal with what seem like insoluble predicaments instead of relatively simple problems that we faced maybe 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago. And so this, where we are is here, where we and it's now. And so what do we do? How do we act as individuals, as families, as communities, as societies in light of this information, all of which points towards we have fouled our nest? Where do we go from here? Do we start cleaning up the nest that we've fouled? Do we take actions rooted in justice, in moderation, in virtue today? Or do we just keep on keeping on as if this is a normal and rational way to live?
It seems like there are more people rather rapidly compared to recent history. By that I mean like 50, 100 years, who are making valiant efforts, at this late date to try to make some changes. And, well, they're becoming more aware, for one thing. There's a whole lot more, just reading the news on alternate news or mainstream media even. You see a whole lot of people trying to do things to solve problems, usually in their own silo, so to speak. But I do see, it pleases me to see so many people coming to these conclusions and working on various things. There's, I don't know how many ideas they've got out now for, just for example, absorbing CO2, pulling it back in. None of them seem to be doable at any kind of scale that would matter.
Well, and not only that, but I think the more important issue is that they don't ask anybody to make any sacrifices. The whole goal, as nearly as I can tell, behind carbon capture and sequestration strategies is so that we can keep on doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
The George H.W. Bush's motto, the American way of life is non-negotiable, seems to be firmly planted into our society.
You talk about Bush the Elder?
Yes.
Yeah, one of his lines was the one most memorable to me. Something like this, slightly paraphrased perhaps. I'm just not into the vision thing.
Right.
And then, there's an old saying, so true, where there is no vision, the people perish, as countless cultures have proven. And I'm starting to hear more visions, but they seem incomplete, and they seem as if people don't realize the magnitude of things that need to be dealt with simultaneously.
Well, I think that's huge. I think you're absolutely right about that. I think that's a really big deal. I think that some people think changing our diets will fix it, and other people think controlling the number of children we have will fix it, and other people think the way we shop will fix it, and and on the list goes. But we needed to do all those things a long time ago.
Yeah, and it's as if these people who are saying these things don't actually look out the window, have a garden, or take a walk in nature, or pay any attention to what's really going on right around them, or just even on the news. If you look around the world and see what's going on, it's every day there's new extreme weather events going on. In fact, I was one of the questions I wanted to ask you is just taking a mental tour around the world. What do you see as key focal points that are already a problem? I was reading recently that in 2010 there were 5 million suicides with farmers in India. who had already realized they couldn't function. There's nothing they could do with the climate change. So, but,
yeah,
and then
it was in August of 2010 the United Nations put out a report indicating that we're driving an estimated 150 to 200 species to extinction every day. And that at the time that was being manifest in the ability or the inability to grow food, and in places where it's marginal to begin with in the first place to grow that food, places like India, that's when it became especially obvious. So if farmers can't grow food, they can't support their families.
Right. Or us.
Right. And so that takes individual farmers to a very challenging place intellectually and emotionally if they can't support their families because they can't grow the food like their father did, like even they could do maybe 5 or 10 years earlier. Well, that takes you to a very dark place.
Yeah. Not to mention that they are controlled by the banksters.
Of course.
The banksters. And the people who don't touch the soil run the show in terms of getting the prices fixed for that particular year. Not giving loans to farmers who need it desperately. Then, of course, on the larger scale, just agribusiness, where they're even right in Idaho, they were people farming hundreds of acres, dryland farming. Just such a vast amount of monoculture that we depend on. And we've succeeded with the Green Revolution by adding too much nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, which is running off into the waters. That scale makes it utterly inconceivable to continue.
Right, and that brings up another group of people who think they have the solution, and that's permaculture. And here's a classic case. Had we taken a permacultural approach to growing food a long time ago, and had we implemented it a long time ago, we wouldn't be addicted to corn. We wouldn't be addicted to these monocrop systems. But, that train left the station probably right after World War II, maybe before then, maybe several thousand years ago at the beginning of the first civilizations on Earth. But certainly before the people who are currently growing food for the most part, and the people who are consuming that food, people like you and me, long before we came into the picture, the train had already run off the tracks.
Yeah, the Green Revolution was hailed as such a great thing, but it's got so many incredible side effects that are insane. I'd seen Michael Pollan speak once here in Salt Lake and read a couple of his books, and he says we're people of the corn.
Absolutely.
Everything is based on corn, even in the supermarket, not just the food with high fructose corn syrup everywhere, but the linoleum in the tiles. A lot of the building materials in the store have significant components from corn, literally. And then, of course, that's used to feed the meat. So the amount of energy and resources going into a steak are just astronomical.
Right. I think it was the omnivore's dilemma that Pollan pointed out that we are cornier than Mexico. Yeah. That in the United States we consume more corn per person than even Mexico does, which we think of as being a country that thrives on corn. And then bear in mind that up until 1980, high fructose corn syrup did not appear in food. And now you have a hard time walking through your grocery store and finding 10 items that don't have high fructose corn syrup in them.
Yeah. Which is, of course, is followed by obesity at a tragic scale, starting here, spreading around the world quite rapidly.
Right. And it's the entire culture now. It's not something you and I can purposely change at the level of the culture. Yes, we can be careful about how we shop and make sure that we minimize our intake of high fructose corn syrup. But, a lot of people don't have time for that. A lot of people are struggling to get through their 12-hour workday and then feed their
3 jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can we expect them to be checking the labels? And they don't have time for that.
And then, of course, even if you do have time for it, the labels are very often deceiving.
Right, of course. Nobody's going to tell you there's poison in your food.
Yeah. Let's come back for a moment to, we I think covered the IPCC probably enough to just say that it's a bunch of hokum, way underestimating the reality of the situation, not taking into account exponential growth and interactions and things that need to be considered. But assuming that, what do you see as the main factors in causing abrupt climate change?
Well, most people know about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere, and it has taken an exponential path. And there is a pretty direct relationship between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and heating of the planet. So, of course, now that it's gone exponential, we certainly couldn't expect that we could avoid the fate of temperature also going exponential. But then along the way, we tripped all kinds of self-reinforcing feedback loops, the kinds of things the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases warned about in October of 1990. And they were pointing out that we can't go beyond 1 degree Celsius. That was their absolute upper limit above the 1750 baseline. And we're there. We passed that point. And a climate writer and speaker, whose name I forget right now, in 2014 said by the time we triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops, it was somewhere around 1/4 and 1/2 degree above the 1750 baseline. Well, that was a long time ago. So we've triggered these self-reinforcing feedback loops, like methane in the atmosphere.
Which has taken a large, exploded far more dramatically than people were predicting. And where do you see that methane right now? I was reading, for example, that it was just recently, I forget the source of it, and of course I take a lot of what I read with large doses of salt, but they're saying it was 270 times what it was, I think a decade or so ago. The relative amount, I don't know what the absolute amount was, but
yeah, we're up around, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were about 750 parts per billion methane in the atmosphere, and we're now in the neighborhood of 2,000. There's a lot of variation in that number. There's a lot of variation from week to week in the measurement of methane, but I suspect we have long passed 1,500 parts per billion, and we're going to be in the 2,000 to 3,000 parts per billion range for a while. And you have to remember that methane, although it's measured in parts per billion, so tiny numbers, methane is at least 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is in the short term. So if there's even only 2,000 parts per billion, that's the equivalent of 200 parts per million carbon dioxide minimum. And now that we're up over 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, just adding those two greenhouse gases together, we get more than 600 parts per million equivalent carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's ignoring water vapor and chlorofluorocarbons and ozone and more than 30 other greenhouse gases. And remember when James Hansen said 320 was probably too much and 350 was definitely too much, and now we're at the carbon dioxide equivalent of more than 600.
Yeah.
Of course, we're on the we triggered a disaster here because through all those years, through all those people sounding all those warnings, not enough people paid attention, and no surprise, here we are.
Yeah, we're very much creatures of the here and now, and a lot of people, can read about extreme climate changes here and there, but it doesn't. I can't see it from where I live.
Right, right. And the climate speaker and writer I was thinking about was David Spratt, who said half a degree was the absolute upper limit. So that was in October 2014, and and that's the Johnny Come Lately version of the story.
Yes.
We can go all the way back to 1847 with George Perkins Marsh warning us.
Yeah.
And in the journal literature, the peer-reviewed literature, we can go back to 1896 with Svante Arrhenius.
Right.
On and on, the warnings have come. We have to do something different than we're doing today. And the answer, the response, has been to ratchet it up, to go faster, to not do it the way we're doing it today, do it 10 times faster than we're doing it today.
Yeah. Progress towards extinction, as I think I called it before.
Yes.
And then right here in Salt Lake, we talked about this in the interview that Sherry Quinn and I did with you. She was asking about the population in Salt Lake, and I pointed out that we're already sitting on a major fault that's long overdue geologically from all the studies. And now, just yesterday or 2 days ago, they had I think it was a 3.4 magnitude. I think they had two of them just south of the Wasatch Mountains. And then one today in Fillmore, more on the northern end of the valley. And I think it was a little higher than that. But these are two rather large earthquakes right here on one of the most major faults that I think in the world. You can still see the scars from the last ones. I think that was, I want to say 6,000 years or so. But you can still see the scarps. In fact, they've got it's called the Shoreline Trail, which follows the edge of the old Lake Bonneville, as it was called, or as it's called. And along that trail, you can lean against the scarps. They're like the last fault was about 8 or 9 feet, if I got my figures right. It was quite large. That's a humongous jump. So to see these other ones going off right now, and then combine that with Yellowstone, which is not too far away, more and more rumblings every day. And new geysers going higher, and it does not look promising just from that point of view. We were talking last time about plate tectonics, which I think is absolutely major, and the effects of that. And you brought out the fact that the so-called Ring of Fire in the Pacific is going crazier than usual because of the shifting of the plates. And we were talking also about the melting of glaciers, redistributing the weight of the water around the world. And this is one I was trying to get to. That I became aware of it from Paul Beckwith when he's talking about. People are saying there's a new wobble in the Earth. There's always been a couple of natural ones, but very, very minor. But now Paul is suggesting that because of adding all the weight of the water, just redistributing the weight of the planet, it's causing more wobble in the Earth. I think it's pretty recent research. I don't know how far they've come with that. But I'm wondering if you consider that quite feasible.
Yes, absolutely. And in my very long essay that I used to update every few days, Climate Change Summary and Update. I pointed out that there were subtle changes in Earth's rotation resulting from this redistribution of water around the planet, indicating the Earth's poles were shifting. This is from a paper in 2013. So we've known for a while. Again, this is nothing new. This is something that I pointed out five and a half years ago, and so it's still catching some people off guard, but it's been going on for a while.
And that relates also to the shifting of the magnetic North Pole.
Yes, absolutely.
Which has been going on, forever apparently. You can tell from lines in the rocks and how things are lined up, how it has shifted every so often, goes to the opposite polarity. But they used to measure it quite accurately and adjust GPS, things that depend on GPS locations, every 5 years. They've now moved it up to every year because it's affecting communications around the world, with satellites and whatever else is tied into the GPS monitoring. So it's happening right before us right now. Coming back to that figure I threw out before, the number of Indian farmers that supposedly committed suicide in 2010, and presumably every year. Obviously, climate change is not a future event, but happening right now. What would be your rough guess at the number of people who have already been gone extinct from climate change and various side effects of it?
Yeah.
Even.
The climate change was causing the early death of 5 million people a year in 2012.
Okay.
And that's a long time ago. When we talk about the topic of abrupt climate change, that's the last number I've seen. Is 5 million, and that's 7 years ago. So. Obviously, it's bound to be much higher than that now. I just haven't seen any updated figures on that topic, so it's hard to say. Given that we're in the arena of exponential climate change, and it's obvious now, and it was not obvious in 2012, it wouldn't surprise me if it was double, triple, quadruple that number. None of those would. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if we're in the arena of 4 or 5 times that number of people dying per year as a result of consequences of climate change. And it's one of those things that's difficult to evaluate. A friend of mine is a medical doctor in Canada. She's from Germany, and her father was put into the hospital in Germany. And the situation is different now than when they built the hospitals there throughout Germany. So he died. He overheated, and because he was in a hospital without air conditioning. And nobody attributed that death to climate change or to abrupt climate change except her. She's a medical doctor, and she attributed it to that, but that was obviously not the official cause of death. But so how do we draw the line? It's almost certainly a far higher number of people that die as a result of climate change than we will ever know about, because the official statistics don't keep track.
Well, I think it's safe to say that the human extinction is well underway. Literally, with people actually dying in these large numbers that we don't have accurate ways to measure, or if, for example, there's a mudslide in Japan, the cause of death is a mudslide, right? But that was caused by warming or overwatering, overprecipitation
Right, right, and that's a catastrophe, and it's a large number of deaths at one time. But how many people are dying from starvation relatively slowly? How many people
Mm-hmm.
are dying because they don't have ready access to clean water, and
Mm-hmm.
so they're drinking filthy water that doesn't kill them in an instant, doesn't wipe out a village in a short period of time, but over time it has its impacts. You
Well,
know,
look at Yemen. Yemen has, well, of course, that's largely directly human induced, thanks to our military sales to Saudi Arabia, whatever. But yeah, the kids are literally starving. There's cholera all over, and other diseases expected to be breaking out. Um, yeah.
right? You look at infectious diseases and diseases borne by other organisms, and they're all on the rise, as I was
Yeah.
describing to my students in classes 25 years ago. Of
Yeah.
course, with relatively minor increases in global average temperature, when that's the limiting factor to biological activity, and you raise the temperature just a little bit, especially nighttime temperatures in the winter, then you're going to
Mm-hmm.
see an explosion like we already have of things like Lyme disease and dengue and malaria, and the list just goes
Zika,
on and on.
Zika virus is pretty
Right,
doing quite well.
right, and again, nobody is attributing those deaths, those diseases, to climate change, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly climate change is a contributor
Yep.
to the increased number of disease and death from those organisms.
Mm-hmm. And that gets into the whole invasion of species that's been going on since we first started sailing around the world. And now we've got, how many thousands of large cargo ships coming from China to San Francisco, wherever they land, and
Right.
going around the world as well. Or even boats they put on lakes in New England or the Great Lakes have I forget the name of the algae or seaweed that has literally shut down lakes for boating because of invasive species carried in on the bottoms of other boats from, say, down south. They dump them, they put them in the water here. Um, I've heard biologists say, someone, I forget who it was, I think a couple years ago, saying that this is the most relevant or significant problem right now is the movement of invasive species, where some species comes in and finds a new habitat ideal for them, the zebra mussels of the Great Lakes, things like that. And it's, with our modern transportation between the ships and the planes, we're carrying who knows what from where to where. Um, which leads me to another question that I wanted to ask, and that is restoration of ecosystems. I've seen examples pretty dramatic. One of the most dramatic was I was doing a chapter for a book on skiing in the Wasatch, and the guy wanted me, the editor publisher wanted me to do a chapter on ski area ecology, which I did, and I was astounded to see some pictures from the mining days, like the 1850s or so, of Alta, Utah, famous ski area. And it was just every tree was gone. I mean, it was just beyond belief. And then there was another picture taken from the same spot, same view angle of the lens, and it looked totally, well, I can't say totally, but very, very largely restored. You know? And that amazed me that in that amount of time that restoration could take place. You see it also with, after a mining operation, you know, leaving aside all the damage that does in itself, they put grasses down because they're so quick growing and they take root so quickly. And to me, that is amazing.
Right. Right. And so you pointed out a couple of things here. One, the interactions really matter. So it's not only the non indigenous species arriving to new areas, it's not only the relatively small rise in global average temperature. It's not only human activities that cause the local environment to change. It's all of these things interacting with each other in what scientists call positive interactions, but that aren't necessarily positive for us.
Right.
And so it's a little bit here and a little bit there, and these things tend to be multiplicative, not merely additive. So that's important. And then there are things we don't know. So we can, we go to these places like in the mining days of the 1840s, 50s, 60s, even the 1870s in the western United States, the interior West for the most part, and humans just laid them bare, and it was just rocks. And now you return to those places and they're beautiful and the forest has recovered. There are things we don't know. And among them are the positive as well as the negative outcomes of our actions.
Yes.
So,
have you done any work personally in the field with restoration of ecosystems or species?
No. I used to teach as a tiny part of a big class, so I only know the little enough to be dangerous. So we probably better not proceed down that path.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. We talked about cooling the oceans heating up, absorbing all the heat that they've been absorbing, now warming up to where we've killed, in my opinion, the most beautiful natural gift to us, so to speak. The Great Barrier Reef is essentially dead. I do read that there's some life there, but it's pretty minimal. With the oceans heating up, being more acidified, it's highly unlikely that's going to come back.
Right.
That should be like headline news everywhere.
Right.
It's hard to.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and these are among the most biologically rich places on the planet, and that's the big one. That is the big one when it comes to coral reefs in the world, and look what we've done in really a very short period of time, and it's heart-wrenching, it's horrifying, it's terrible. It's how many ways can you possibly say we have killed this thing, and it didn't take us long at all, and this is horrible, and there's no getting it back.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to when I was talking about restoration. I can't even imagine how we could possibly cool the oceans. We'd have to literally, physically get heat off the earth and out into whatever space is at right now.
And so far, the oceans have served as a tremendous battery that have stored carbon dioxide and heat. And with the next El Nino, which appears to be underway, there's going to be some heat that's released. And so it's going to drive up temperatures in terrestrial areas, even though officially every source I've seen indicates that it's going to be a minor El Nino event. That could be what triggers the relatively abrupt loss of habitat for humans all over the planet. That's one of really a handful of different events that could cause functional extinction by removing habitat for humans on Earth. It could be a burst of methane out of the Arctic Ocean. It could be simply continued industrial activity that further heats up the planet. It could be decreased industrial activity because of global dimming or the aerosol masking effect, which has been greatly underestimated according to a February 8th, 2019 paper by Rosenfeld et al. It could be a decline in grain harvest because of, for example, an 83% decline of earthworms worldwide, as pointed out in a June 2018 paper in Soil Systems. It could be the ice-free Arctic. So there's a handful of triggers that could cause the unexpected demise of civilization, of this set of living arrangements, because of these relatively minor changes at the global level that domino into bringing down the whole system. And then we trigger the loss of the aerosol masking effect or global dimming. And then we're talking about no habitat for humans on the whole planet in a matter of months, not decades, not years, but weeks or months.
Yes.
And you can't get anybody to talk about it. I don't hear anybody on the nightly news having this conversation.
Yeah, we should aim to have a few links, I'm thinking, under this interview podcast, such as the aerosol effect, the one you just mentioned.
Right.
You said that was 2018?
Well, the latest paper is from 2019. From I'm tracking it down right now. It's the paper that concluded that the aerosol masking effect has been greatly underestimated is from the 8th of February, this month.
Jesus.
And that's all of the literature on, essentially all of the peer-reviewed literature on climate change over the course of the last 10 years has pointed out a worse and worse scenario.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, I never see you go on sort of in a positive direction, except for minor examples here and there that don't amount to much in the larger scheme of things. I wanted to ask you one more thing I thought of on the aerosol masking effect. There are, of course, many kinds of aerosols, and we were talking specifically, I think, about the sulfates from coal,
right? Mainly,
but is it conceivable? It seems to me conceivable that a team of brilliant chemists could come up with an aerosol that would replace that. In the unlikely event we stop burning coal, highly unlikely, but just theoretically, there could be some other aerosol that could be controlled better, could stay up better, be lighter,
right,
have more of an albedo effect, and then, ideally with a long-term plan of pulling them out slowly to give us a chance to work on the renewables.
Right, absolutely, and that's the dream. That's the dream that is built into most of the forward projections regarding climate change, is that we will come up with these miracles that will solve some aspect of what we're currently doing.
It's sort of a catch-22. I mean, in the larger scheme, I'm totally on board with you and infinite other climatologists who are able to speak out and do speak out that the game is over. But at the same time, if you want to invent something or come up with something new, you have to make the assumption it can be done to just get started, and then oftentimes pieces fill in. I say that based on my own two inventions of water play and the airship I mentioned before. But and if you assume, it seems like it's critical to assume it can be done, even if you believe in your heart that it can't be. But I'm guessing you would call that the path of, how did you put it in Buddhist terms, correct living?
Right.
Something like that.
Right action without being attached to the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can, and to the extent I believe in a should, that we should be doing. Sure. Not necessarily on behalf of humanity, but on behalf of the non-human species that we share the planet with.
Right.
And that includes reducing the human population, preferably not down to zero, in a week. No functional extinction within such a short period of time that humans are taken out immediately. But this is part of the message I would transmit were I emperor for a day or a week or a month or a year, is that it's not just us here on planet Earth. There's a bunch of other species we share the planet with, and it's time we started thinking about them with the same kinds of positive, future hoping thoughts that
Yeah.
we've been dreaming about for our own children.
Yeah. And then there's the issue of, what's the point in living on a pretty much lifeless planet with cockroaches, starling, and humans, weeds maybe. I don't realize that's not really a correct term. Just a plant that people don't want in their gardens.
Right.
But with that lack of diversity, I like to think I've watched every one of David Attenborough's films, and he just shows how magical and astounding Earth is.
Right.
Yeah, with these other creatures on it that we are snuffing left and right, in a million different ways. But you got to ask, at what point is life not worth living?
Right.
Just because of that.
Absolutely. And I'm not interested in living in a bunker. I'm not interested in living on a planet that is that doesn't resemble the planet I grew up with. And
right.
We're already not far from that because of what
right.
we've done so far.
Right. Yeah, the question I pose to myself is it's got to be personal for every person, but at what point does the horror show become too horrifying to go on? And flip side of that, or the sequel to that, to die with dignity. I assume you've thought about that, and I realize it's kind of personal and no need to answer it if you don't want to, but do you see a point where you would view the planet as not worth living because of the lack of diversity?
Sure, and I don't know what that point is, and I think it's personal for every one of us.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who have spent their lives essentially never getting off the pavement and working office jobs,
right.
And so they have not interacted with the natural world in ways that I have. And so
yes.
I suspect those people will have a lower standard when it comes to losing life on Earth and what they can tolerate.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is for me. Is it the ionizing radiation from the nuclear power plants that is triggered, that is essentially certain to kill all life on Earth in a relatively short period of time? Is it the abrupt global average rising temperature that kills every tree on the Earth within?
Touch on that point a little more on the nuclear meltdowns that are inevitable when there's nobody there to keep them going.
Yeah, the lethal mutations that result will contribute to a relatively long-term demise of most organisms on the planet. The period will be shorter for species that can produce multiple generations in a short period of time. For long-lived species like us and like wolves,
right.
Things look good around Chernobyl, for example, for the wolves.
Right.
But that wolf population will not be producing wolves in a few generations because of the lethal mutations. It looks great now, and so deniers of the impacts, of the negative impacts of ionizing radiation, point to the here and now and say, look, wolves everywhere. All we had to do was clear the humans out. Well, those are badly diseased wolves. Those are damaged wolves. And at some point they become incapable of passing along those genes so that to ensure future generations of wolves in that area.
Speaking of Chernobyl, I was just reading, I think this morning or yesterday, that they had a big fire break out there where a lot of the harmful radiation exists still, and that seems likely to me to be carrying the lethal ionizing elements. I'm not sure which ones were the prominent ones, but a long distance and affecting other organisms. So yeah, it's interesting to look at. There was a video I saw not long ago. Someone flew a drone through Chernobyl, and it looks beautiful. I mean, trees growing out the windows. It looks like nature is making a strong rebound. But yeah, the ionizing radiation goes on I forget the half-life even of these things that I once knew. But well,
Right, and this is another one of those things that so few people think about. And 3 Mile Island was a near miss. Chernobyl was not a near miss. It was an utter catastrophe that we managed to cover up by pouring a bunch of concrete on it and getting the people out of the specific, very dangerous zone. Fukushima is an ongoing catastrophe.
Which isn't being reported on.
No.
From what I gather.
And it will never end.
Yeah.
It is never going away in the history of human beings on planet Earth, period.
We have untold oil drums, 55-gallon drums of used radioactive waste, I'm assuming plutonium in large measure, dumped in the ocean. Oh, who knows where.
Right.
But the Army was doing that long ago.
Right,
it's
absolutely. There's so many things that we don't even know about, and I'd be willing to bet that almost all those things are horrible. I mean, there's a reason we don't know, because they're horrible. They're too horrible to admit to the populace.
Yes, right. You talked, I believe, once about, I know you've talked about the ozone layer, and my recollection is you were saying that it was, someone was saying, well, it still seems to be there, and your response was, well, yes, but it's thinner in some spots.
Yeah, we thought we solved the ozone in the Antarctica problem,
right?
And all we did was finally reduce the rate of growth, and then apparently get it to stop growing. So it's not gone away. Meanwhile, thin spots in the ozone have been popping up all over the planet. And so at the same time that we banned chlorofluorocarbons, especially in the United States and Western Europe, we continued to do all kinds of other things that didn't turn out so well. And apparently China, who of course in the United States we love to blame for everything, apparently China didn't cease production of and use of chlorofluorocarbons. So the ozone keeps thinning in various places around the planet, and it should come as no surprise that it feels hotter some places.
Yeah, you were talking, you were questioning whether, I think it was UVC or UVB, I forget which one, might have been, someone had suggested it might be causing the insect die-off, and you were asking for more information on that, whichever form of UV it was.
Right, that was UVC.
UVC, right? Okay.
Yeah. And I didn't get any response, so I put it out there.
Oh, okay.
I wrote specifically to the two lead authors of the paper I was quoting, and neither one of them responded to me, which is quite rare among scientists to not respond to another scientist when they have a serious question. So I don't know what's going on there, and I doubt we ever fully know what's going on there.
You correct me if I'm wrong on this, but did you, or expand if I'm correct, you talked about the radiation from the meltdown of nuclear power plants taking out the ozone layer, I think. Did I get that right?
Right, yes. That's as I understand it, that the ozone will be stripped away by ionizing radiation. Now, as it turns out, the relatively recent journal literature, most notably in a paper called Co-Extinctions Annihilate Planetary Life During Extreme Environmental Change. This paper, which came out on November 13th of last year, 2018, indicates that we don't need ionizing radiation to reduce the planet to a lifeless rock floating through space, that only 5 or 6 degree global average temperature rise, that's 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, will cause the loss of habitat for every species on the Earth. And of course, it's all about rate. That paper presumes a rate that will get us to that global average temperature rise in a century, because that's the kind of numbers we commonly throw about. But, we could easily be headed for that sort of temperature rise within a matter of less than a decade. So that suggests that an even faster rate of change suggests that, yeah, we might not even need the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of the world's 450 and change nuclear power plants to cause the loss of all life on Earth.
Yeah. It's hard to believe people are still pushing nuclear power. Even if you look at it from an economic standpoint, it makes no sense.
Right. Well, a key point here, it does make sense for a relatively few people who make a lot of money off the building of every one of those plants. So I think that's important to keep in mind. It doesn't make sense from the economic standpoint of each individual nuclear power plant. No, but that's never been the point.
Yeah. Yeah, and that has, of course, been one of the large reasons for the spread of nuclear weapons, by just spreading the knowledge of nuclear power plants, which is closely related from all I've seen. It does appear that a lot of companies are canceling their plans for nuclear power. That the projected rate of new ones is, according to people who I consider most knowledgeable, close to non-existent. But we still got the ones we've got.
Right, exactly. And I don't see any serious effort to cask and contain those. And I consider this probably the greatest moral obligation we have to planet Earth as human beings, is to cask and to contain as quickly as possible. And I had a conversation in Florida with a government employee who has taken that on as his special project for the rest of his life. We'll see if it goes anywhere. He appeared to be nearly as frustrated as I was about it. So that doesn't necessarily bode well.
Yeah, right. The figures that I've read, maybe I've heard some from you, but that it would take typically 60 years to fold up, if you want to call it that, a nuclear power plant. It would decades at least with existing technology, which is mainly, I gather, dumping concrete over everything.
Right.
Have you seen anything on how quickly they could actually be decommissioned and made, well, I can't say safe completely, but relatively safe? Like, if full attention were put on it by knowledgeable people in that area and they had the funding, does it look like they could be closed down quicker?
Well, yes. I think according to this government employee I spoke with in Florida a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, yes, we could at least make the situation far, far better than it would otherwise be. You know, some places are just set up for utter catastrophe because so many of those nuclear power plants were built in terrible places to build them, right along the ocean.
Right.
So,
San Andreas Fault.
Right. And, unlike Chernobyl at Fukushima, you cannot go in and dump a bunch of cement on the core because the core is basically in the ocean. It's literally too fluid to, so you can't count on the bedrock to serve as a stopping point for pouring the concrete. So that's a huge problem, but I would argue that every one of those nuclear power plants that is somehow made safer than it otherwise would be is a step in the right direction. Can we ensure that all 450 some of them are sealed in the same kind of way that Chernobyl is sort of sealed? It would surprise me, but every one of them is an utter catastrophe in waiting. So let's at least give it a shot so that when we exit the planetary stage, we can at least say, as individuals and as a species, well, we try to do something to clean up our mess before we left the stage.
Yeah. Going back to the Florida politician you talked to, did he give some kind of number on how
He said they can be a lot safer in 2 years by doing
Oh, really?
something than not.
Uh,
So if we do something, if we throw enough money and people at it,
right.
if we do something, then he says that in 2 to 4 years, the situation could be a whole lot better than if we do nothing.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's not safely decommissioning, and he admits that it's not going all the way to decommissioning the power plant,
Right.
but it's taking a step in the right direction that probably will make a significant difference.
Well, that's good to hear, even though you realize in the context of the overall picture, it's not so great. But I was curious. You've spoken a lot about Edward Abbey, whose books I've read a number of. I was actually a minor monkey wrencher for a while there. Many dreams for growing larger, but I don't want to get locked up.
Right.
But is he? He appears to be one of your heroes.
He was a major influence on my life at an important
Okay.
time. When I was an
Yeah.
undergraduate in college, I
Mm-hmm.
began reading his books
Yeah.
and voraciously. And so,
Yes.
yes, he was an important figure for me. And
Mm-hmm.
and now that I have become friends with the man who inspired the character, George Washington Hayduke, I'm
Uh,
I'm even more impressed with Edward Abbey
uh,
and his legacy than I was before.
uh, and you told me that on his tombstone he had no comments, which I found fascinating. But it got me thinking about my own tombstone. Even though I intend to be cremated, I'll probably be buried in Yellowstone ash or whatever. The house will collapse in the next earthquake here. But one that would fit me and I would say be appropriate for the whole human race. They couldn't get along. They were unable to get along.
Yeah, in my many years of teaching courses on college campuses, I encourage students to come up with their obituary or their whatever it's called these days in the newspaper,
Right.
and also to come up with after that to come up with their tombstone, what
Yeah.
what it would say on their tombstone, because if your favorite description of yourself is father, brother, friend, that tells me a lot about what you want to do with your life. And I think it should tell you a lot about the meanings you are assigning to your life. And so that was the point of that exercise.
I think it's an excellent exercise, and people should do it everywhere. Everyone who hears this should do it. It just gets you focused on what really matters.
Right, right.
The way the Nobel Peace Prize started, or yeah, I think it was the Peace Prize, was there was an obituary for, I think it was Alfred Nobel, I think was his name, but they had it was his brother who died, and they got the names mixed up, and or maybe it was just a premature obituary. They thought he had died, he hadn't, but it talked about him as being the founder of dynamite, or the designer or inventor of dynamite, and he was so upset by that he started the Nobel Prize to kind of alleviate his conscience, which I found quite amusing. But yeah, the obituary idea is a really good one.
We spend so little time in this culture thinking about what's important to us. We spend most of our time pursuing the expectations of others. What does this culture think I should do, and then trying to fit in to that model, and not really thinking about the legacy I want to leave, how I want to be remembered.
Have you got your obituary in mind?
Oh, I've written it many times. I'm stunned I haven't had to use one yet. Most recently, I wrote my last will and testament, and I requested that my body be chopped up into little tiny pieces and thrown to the wind so that the wild animals could eat them. And I don't think that's probably legal, but it's something.
Yeah, well, and you've got Timothy Leary floating around in space, his ashes. That's what he had done. I thought that was quite amusing. You talked last time about, you gave out the number 3 trillion trees, and I was trying to remember whether that was what we've taken down or how many exist now.
Oh, right. There's about 3 trillion trees on the planet, and that's half as many as there was at the time. At the time of, say, Anglo settlement.
Right.
In the Western world. Yeah.
It's a huge amount of trees to plant. It's not gonna.
Right, and so when you read something, somebody proposes that we plant a few million trees, even bear in mind that that's barely a dent in the trillions we have lost.
Yeah. We talked along that line also about genetic engineering, and there was a group, and I think it's UCLA, somewhere down there, that was working on taking a substance which I refresh my memory, it's a suberin, which is apparently in all trees, to some degree, but in certain species of bamboo trees, I think it was cork trees. It was very, very high, and it is absorbs an amazing amount of carbon dioxide and sequesters it relatively well. The bamboo, they're talking about, okay, I'm getting mixed up. Those folks were talking about putting it into crops, and they said about 1/5 of the current agriculture, if it had this particular gene to increase the amount of suberin in it, it was things we could eat, peas, wheat, don't know if corn was in there, soybeans I think was there, and you said you weren't familiar with it, but you had an opinion based on David Suzuki's work, for example, of the dangers of genetic engineering, which are obviously enormous. But when you're down to the wire of survival and trying something, it seems like you're going to want to try something.
Right. And I was actually interviewed by a couple of guys who wanted to make a futuristic television show about what are we going to have to look like to survive into the future. And so I actually have spent a little bit of time thinking about this. And it's also science fiction-y that I hate to even go there.
Yes.
Because I don't think we're headed for a Star Trek world.
Right. Yeah. No, I don't see that either. I gather that you suspect that we will look more like Mars than Venus. Is that?
Yeah, that's my guess, but I don't think there's going to be a human around to observe it either way.
Yeah, right. Of course. Yeah. And we want to.
And because of a couple of things. One, the ionizing radiation from the catastrophic meltdown of the world's nuclear power facilities, and also because of this latest paper indicating the loss of all life on Earth from a relatively minor, what they call extreme environmental change, but a relatively minor global average increase in temperature. Because of either one or two of those two, much less the both of them, I'm forced to think that we're headed for Mars instead of Venus, a lifeless rock floating through space. That's not what I want. Don't get me wrong.
Of course. Yeah, I think it should be made clear that I'd like to make it clear that you're not advocating human extinction in any way, shape, or form, but the exact opposite.
Exactly.
And yet you're accused of this, by who knows how many people.
Apparently, I make money at it.
Yeah, right. Another wonderful myth. There
I
was one.
we've seen movies about people who make money by killing people, but I'm not one of those people.
Yeah, well, you got to be Raytheon or Boeing or Lockheed or Northrop or something. So, I mentioned this Jim Renwick before, and I wanted to go into two topics there. He says, I'm looking at a paper I printed out. The detail on his view, your view, of the climate system can be gained by reading his Monster Climate Change essay, which I do recommend. And I think the last one you put out was sometime last year, was it?
I stopped updating that in August of 2016, actually.
Oh, really? Okay,
And the current version of that I'm updating periodically is called Extinction Foretold, Extinction Ignored, and there's a link to it depending on which device you're on, either in the bottom right of your computer or the very bottom of your mobile device.
Oh.
So that's the one I'm updating most recently, is Extinction Foretold, Extinction Ignored.
Okay. Renwick suggests, now this came out in 2014, so we can maybe forgive him a little bit, but he talks about Sam Carana, and he says, in parentheses, not his or her real name, hyphen, you know why, like suggesting that you are Sam Carana. And you had originally, in our first interview there, you said you would talk a little more about, could talk a little more about Sam Carana, whoever he, she, or they may be. And I wonder if you can just give the executive summary of Sam Carana.
Yeah, I have a pretty good idea who that is. I used to think it was 2 or 3 individuals. Now I believe it's one climate scientist working somewhere in Europe who doesn't have the same sort of protection with tenure that United States scientists have. And that's my best guess. And it is somebody who is a climate scientist. I can assure you it's not me. And you know it's not me because there's nobody threatening to take away Sam Carana's job because nobody knows who that is.
Well, also, from what the little bit I've read, doesn't square with things you're saying anyway. So.
Right. I don't believe we're headed for a 10°C global average temperature rise in 2026, for example. And I think there was an error in the paper indicating that. Also, I used to think it was 2 or 3 people because he or she is so prolific that it's got to be more than one person's work. And I still think it's remarkable how much work Sam Carana puts out. And I mean, I'm working pretty hard here to keep up with the relevant information, and I don't put out nearly as much information as Sam Carana does.
Yeah. Okay, so here's one paragraph from Renwick or Renwick, whatever, Renwick. Again, about 2014. I'll read the paragraph. The way Guy McPherson talks about water vapor shows his such sketchy grasp of atmospheric physics, which apparently Renwick does specialize in. He states, that would be you, that most of the water vapor in the atmosphere is above 6-kilometer altitude, where it, quote, acts like a lens to heat the earth. Okay. I'll just keep reading. Most of the water vapor is actually in the lowest few kilometers in the atmosphere, as the upper troposphere is too cold to support much water vapor, which I believe is true. Perhaps he's thinking of the release of latent heat in the tropics, which does occur mostly in the upper troposphere, leading to a warming hotspot in the tropical upper troposphere as greenhouse gas concentrations rise. That doesn't sound like you.
No, because it's not. I mean, Renwick followed me around on tour, misquoted me frequently, having been to 2 of my presentations, having talked to me individually in person. And he went out of his way to do a couple of things that were unprofessional, to say the least. One of those is to misquote me regularly, purposely, and such as in the case with the upper troposphere.
Yep.
And another was to not give me an opportunity to respond to the information
Yes.
he was putting out. He also
Yeah.
quoted ancient documents. He quoted the IPCC's third assessment shortly after the fifth assessment had come out with respect to global dimming. So he had to go back 10 or more years to come up with a number that was low enough for him to stomach. But
Yeah.
but now we know that the aerosol masking effect, or so-called global dimming, is far worse than we imagined it was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So
Well, getting back to the physics here, um, water vapor is obviously a major factor. Clouds increasing the albedo, has been advocated by various people above the Arctic and wherever. Um, where does the water vapor reside? What layer of atmosphere
it's
or elevation above ground
it's in the
level?
troposphere. It's primarily in the upper troposphere. It's more than 99% of the water vapor is in the troposphere.
Okay.
The average height varies depending upon where you are. It's 18 kilometers above Earth in the tropics. It's only 6 kilometers in the polar regions in the wintertime. So the total average height of the troposphere is about 13 kilometers above the Earth. And more than 90% of the, actually more than 99% of the water vapor ends up in and spends most of its time in the troposphere. And by volume, water vapor accounts for more than 90% of greenhouse gases. So this is a big deal. Also, this is a self-reinforcing feedback loop that occurs over a very short period of time. From the time the water evaporates on Earth, gets to the upper troposphere, and starts magnifying additional evaporation is a matter of days. It's not a matter of years, it's a matter of days. This is what we call
Now,
a rapid
how
self-reinforcing
would it
feedback loop.
magnify existing evaporation if it is acting as increasing the albedo in the form of clouds?
Oh, it's
Or
no. These are separate issues.
okay.
So, for a long time, climate scientists, there was this debate running in the climate science community about whether evaporation was good or bad because it contributed to clouds, which whiten and increase albedo. Here I'm talking only about water vapor as a greenhouse gas that rests in the in the troposphere and acts as a self-reinforcing feedback loop. As it turns out, its impact towards warming the Earth is far greater than the albedo impact from producing clouds.
So it ships the UV waves back to Earth.
Yes, it magnifies the heat by serving as a blanket, if you will,
Yeah.
like carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
Okay, I get it. So let's see. And I was influenced considerably by Rachel Carson back in ninth grade, reading Silent Spring, and I'm just wondering. I'm already seeing fewer birds here, different variations in the number of, say, of hummingbirds. Now, it could be natural. I know they go in cycles, but it seems like Silent Spring could be this spring, conceivably.
Yes.
Next spring.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Silent Spring, the book, was published in 1962, and imagine, if you will, that Rachel Carson was a government scientist working for the federal government at the time.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to imagine a federal government employee writing a book of pointing out the dire future if we don't change our ways today, that the kind of book she wrote in 1962. And yes, we are facing a silent spring. We already, almost everywhere I go, that I'm familiar with, and I'm most familiar with the Intermountain West, such as where you live, and all the way down through the Intermountain West down to southern Arizona, all the way up to northern Idaho where I grew up. It's already quieter than it used to be, and we don't need major changes in the environment to produce major changes in habitat for species, especially the species that are eating a whole bunch of other species, like the birds.
Yeah, I was curious, but I figured you threw out just a little bit ago about the earthworm population, according to someone, had decreased by 83%. I think was the number you gave. Am I correct? You were talking about earthworms disappearing.
Yes, there's a recent study actually from June of last year indicating that we have lost on average 83.3% of earthworms, which is
astounding.
That's a huge number.
It's astounding. I mean,
and even if you don't know anything about gardening, I think most people know the importance of earthworms to maintaining soil structure in native soils. So, yes, this is a really big deal.
I was quite. The reason I came back to that because let's see, the summer before last, we do a modest amount of gardening here. My wife is really into it, and I try to keep up and be her hot tender, so to speak, digging a lot of holes. But it was 2 or 3 summers ago. I saw hardly any earthworms. Well, actually, saw no earthworms. And whereas before, I couldn't stick the shovel in without cutting one in half. Pretty close to that, anyway. So, I'm saying to my wife, if this continues, we will not be having a garden much longer.
Right.
I'm not trying to scare her, but just point this out. And I was happy to see something of a rebound last year. So I have no idea what it will be. But I have no clue either what's causing that.
Right. Well, it's probably a variety of factors, as is almost always the case with ecological systems. The paper is by Robert J. Blakemore, and it appeared in Soil Systems on the 1st of June, 2018. It's called Critical Decline of Earthworms from Organic Origins under Intensive Humic SOM Depleting Agriculture. And so the biomass losses ranged from 50 to 100%, with a mean of 83.3%. So this is huge. Anybody who spent any time outdoors, and when we were kids, of course, earthworms were one of the most attractive things for young boys like us.
Of course.
Yeah.
They fried nicely under my magnifying glass.
Right.
And typical idiot. I didn't do too much of that. But then I saw a video in France. They have an invasion of something like the earthworm, but it isn't, and I'm not sure. I forget the name. It's been a while since I saw the video, but they were killing the earthworms. They'd eat the earthworms, and the main guy studying it, had no idea how they were going to deal with that, but it was obviously going to kill the soil in France.
Right.
Surrounding areas, I gathered. That's one thing that really astounds me is people's lack of understanding of the web of life, and that we are an intimate part of nature. Every breath we take is brought to us by plankton or trees, or give the oxygen there.
Right.
And people say, "Oh, so what about insects? We hardly ever see them." But that's what other things feed on.
Right.
Well,
Right, and the so-called insect apocalypse is making great news, and I think it's hugely important that it makes the news because it's actually bringing attention to a phenomenon that most people have begun to notice. Because it's hard to ignore when you grow up like we did, and every time you took a drive, your windshield was completely covered with invertebrates in 20 minutes. I mean, when I was a kid, and I know you love stories that start like that, we used to have to stop at the gas station not because we were out of gas, but because we had to clean the windshield.
Yeah, I remember well. I also remember riding my motorcycle. I think it was somewhere in Massachusetts, and I guess I had my mouth open, and some insect that I have no idea what it was went straight into my mouth, did a nice ricochet off the back of my throat and down into my esophagus. It was kind of horrifying at the time, but yeah, there's an enormous decline in those, and it's so critical for. I mean, it's the foundation of other life.
Right. Absolutely, and again, we are, for the most part, so far removed from nature, from the living planet, that most people just don't know.
Yeah. Who do you consider some of the more trustworthy climatologists? That, I mean, I'm sure you have differences with all or most of them, but in general, for example, you seem to get along quite well with Paul Beckwith, although you are not in total agreement on, what can be done. But,
right, and
just wondering if other names. You mentioned Paul Wadhams a couple of times.
Peter Wadhams has done some wonderful work. He's a physicist, and so we disagree about the outcome of, for example, an ice-free Arctic, and what that means for our species and many others. So, as with Wadhams and Beckwith and, quote, Sam Carana, there are many people whose work I draw from, and because I'm a generalist and somebody who connects the dots, I don't necessarily see eye to eye with any of these people, because they're not going to the same place by the same direction that I'm getting there. So, you have to bear in mind that most climate scientists have degrees in physics or astronomy or planetary sciences. So, they lacking knowledge of biology and ecology has serious consequences. And I just don't want to say much more than that, because I've already offended most of the people on Earth, and I don't need to cover the rest of them in this short interview.
That's fine. Okay. I wanted to ask you again. You were defining yourself as an anarchist, which of course raises the hackles of so many people, not me. But you defined it in a way that a good operational definition.
Well, let's go right to the root. Let's go to the etymology of the word. An as a prefix means lacking or not. Archy means ruler. So anarchy means no ruler.
Right.
So chaos is the absence of rules. Anarchy is the absence of rulers. And and that's a very, very big difference. I am no fan of hierarchical systems that allow one or a few individuals to control matters of importance, like the food supply and the water supply. And that's what civilizations do and have done since they arose several thousand years ago. So anarchy is not chaos. As I already indicated, one of the significant influences in my life was Edward Abbey, and he received his master's degree at the University of New Mexico, writing a thesis on anarchism, and he came to be known as the desert anarchist. And it's not surprising then that my understanding of anarchism is influenced by him and matches his worldview.
Yes. Well, the flip side of that would be, what is the alternative? I mean, obviously, you could easily say truly educated people realizing we're all one and the same species. We should be kind to one another. We should have a pretty functional conscience. But I don't see, even having spent 25 years in elementary education, I don't see how to assure that across the board.
Right.
So I'm just wondering your thoughts on the alternative to anarchy.
Well,
and even the sense you're mentioning, or how would you expand on it in the sense you're mentioning?
Well, anarchism or anarchy was the way humans lived for the first couple of million years of the human experience, and certainly for the first 300,000 years or so of our own species, Homo sapiens. It was only when the global average temperature rose slightly above Ice Age temperature to about 13.5 degrees Celsius, and then very importantly stabilized at that temperature. That's what allowed the ability to grow grains at relatively large scale. And once you can grow grains and store them and distribute them at a relatively large scale, then, and as nearly as I can tell, only then, can you have control over your food supply through the years. So once you have the ability to do that, then you can outgrow your land base. Then you can go into human population overshoot, initially at the local level and then at the regional level. And now, of course, we've done that at the global level. And so diverging from anarchism, which, according to Daniel Quinn, deceased last year, the contemporary example of anarchism is found in the circus. And I tend to agree with that. So there's the circus boss, the person who, when the circus gets to a site, takes command, if you will, and tells which people to set up which tents in which places. But Quinn is quick to point out that when the trapeze artists are working their craft on the trapeze, they're in charge. Everybody else in the circus is committed to their safety and to making sure they get their act done. And the same is true for each of the other acts as well. So the circus boss doesn't really have any control over what goes on with the trapeze artists. They figure that stuff out on their own, right? So the circus boss is only the boss at a certain time, and that's the case for every other person who is part of that circus, and everybody knows that. So people willingly give up control, give up their power, if you will, to an individual to serve the greater good, and that person varies over time. And so I think that's an excellent model that mirrors, or at least in some way resembles, what humans used to do.
We lived in tribes of 50 to 20 to 100.
And turning as needed to a shaman to figure out the medical issues, turning as needed to the master hunter who takes command of the hunting trip, and so on. But also turning to the people who plant the seeds and prepare the meals. Because at the time they are preparing the meals, they better be in control. You better capitulate to their knowledge. So it's very unlike the situation we have today, and basically since civilizations arose, in which we have this hierarchy, mostly patriarchy.
Yes. Yeah, which of course seems really difficult to conceive of another system, given the population, or even half of the population.
Of course, because this is all we've ever known.
So you would advocate specialists in the various areas that attract them or that they're good at or whatever, and then minimal leadership, just sort of directorship.
Right.
Something along that line.
Right. And when you realize how difficult it is to control your own emotions, to control the path of your own life, and then you want to put somebody else in charge of your life, That
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. And who decided it was a good idea, by the way, for us to work 40 hours a week or longer
Of course.
to secure the things we used to do in a few hours per week?
Yeah.
Food, shelter, water, clothing, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems we took a wrong turn. It seems there's no going back because of, for example, the ability to have this conversation, which is one of the remarkable positive outcomes of industrial civilization. And I don't see a lot of people willing to give that up.
Yeah. One thing that amazes me is the advances in technology that often are used for the good. Of course, one of the first groups to step in and take whatever new technology is the military to kill other people. I went through this when I worked on this airship that I've told you about for over 20 years now. And if I got a nickel for every person who said to me, "Oh, the military could really use that," I just can't believe that's the first thing that comes to their mind. I just find that mentality just horrifying. And I don't know.
Right.
The solution, but
Right. Yeah.
the,
We want a better
irony.
We want a more efficient military?
Yeah,
Really?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, well, I didn't realize we're running over an hour here, so I'm going to just try to ask one or two more things here. I was reading, I think Paul Beckwith again was talking about this, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but the Beishui Glacier is in effect, in Asia, Central Asia, is in effect the third pole. You got the North Pole, South Pole, and this glacier, which is as big as, just area-wise, New Mexico and Texas put together, and it's melting rapidly.
Right.
And
Well, the Himalayas has been called the third pole for a couple
Yeah.
of generations. Yeah.
Okay.
And yes, the third pole is melting quite rapidly. It's not a particular glacier. He might be pointing to a specific one. I haven't seen that video.
Okay.
And again, I reported on this in the essay I stopped updating in August of 2016, with links to the melting of the third pole going on before then. So this is not new.
Yeah. Just accelerating rapidly.
Right. Right. Accelerating rapidly enough that other people are beginning to take notice now.
And that's going to change the dynamics of the crust of the Earth there, where all that weight is disappearing.
Right.
Going into, filling up the oceans even further. So, yeah. Okay,
Right.
then, I'll give you this one last. I'm sure you've pondered the irony of the extinction 250 million years ago being due to an asteroid hitting into Belize, where you are the one announcing
Right.
the next extinction and how quickly it's coming. I do find irony in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what happened was the interstellar body struck the Yucatan Peninsula and raised up Belize off of the from below the Gulf of Mexico onto land and became the Maya Mountains, 750 feet above sea level, where I lived in Belize. So that's a huge impact.
Yes.
And the impact caught oil fields on fire, and the resulting soot in the atmosphere cooled the planet enough that it allowed for the demise of the dinosaurs and the great proliferation of warm-blooded organisms we came to know as mammals, including our predecessors.
Right.
So, you could argue that the mass extinction event then was responsible for us, and and therefore for us triggering the sixth mass extinction.
Yeah, I don't think it's even it's more factual than argumentative, in my opinion.
Right.
From what I
Right.
Okay, well, I'm going to say thank you very much, very, very much to both of you. By the way, I just did order the lady, I forget the exact title, Mr. Ladybug.
Ms. Ladybug, Ms. Ladybug and Mr. Honeybee, A Love Story at the End of Time.
Yeah, I finally got it on my cell phone here. I started looking at it. It was one of the first thing that interested me was that it looked like Pauline was the author of that book.
Pauline is the first author, is the senior author of the book. Yes, we worked on it together.
Okay.
And she did all the artwork. And while we're in the realm here of self-promotion, I'd like to point out that I have a speaking tour coming up in April and early May to include Fairbanks and Juneau, Alaska, the San Francisco Bay Area, up through Portland, Oregon. And you can check the coming events tab at guymcpherson.com for details as they are developed. I was talking to the primary organizer today, and he's got way more events set up than I will possibly be able to survive. So look forward to that. And try to catch me early in the tour before I keel over.
Can I ask who that person is?
Yeah, it's Peter Melton, and he has organized events for me in the past. He lives in the South San Francisco Bay Area and has done a remarkable job for me in the past.
And the reason I ask it is because I'm still thinking of trying to get you and Pauline here to Salt Lake, and the how-to of that. I did talk to the library some time ago, and that would not be a problem there. It would be the promotional end of it that I would need help with.
Right, and I can have you chat with Peter and me. Maybe have a conversation between the three of us to get that happening.
Okay, so we'll put that on the agenda for some time before too terribly long. And meanwhile, thanks to both of you. Thank you, Pauline, for doing this. I hope that you have something on the tape there.
Looks good.
It's looking good from here. It's 2 hours and 19 minutes in. So.
Okay. Oh, really?
Yeah, we covered some ground.
2 hours? Oh my God.
Yeah, time flies when you're talking to Guy McPherson.
a little too fast. It's already going too fast. Okay. Well, thank you, Guy and Pauline. You have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
And you take care.
Look forward to the next time. Bye-bye.